a lot of times this research will not be about journalism. It might be about a broader thing like, information for, freedom and democracy or something like that. And then the fourth kind of research that we might talk about, although I'm not going to talk about this because it's kind of hard to get this kind of research. The research that's conducted by the media companies themselves. And why is it hard to get? Because they want to keep it to themselves, right? So they do research about their audience, their market, where their publications are, distributed and their advertisers and so forth. And they don't want to share that research with the lecturers and the scholars and even journalists at other organizations, right? So sometimes you can find some of this research, but often you can't find the research that's done. So say, a news organization such as Compass, they would not like to share their research with us, right? They want to keep it for themselves. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about two main things, right? One is the topics of research about digital journalism. So what kind of topics? Because you don't just do a research about digital journalism. That's too broad, right? You have to get more specific. Then the other thing I'm going to talk about is the methodologies. And what does that mean? That means the way they did the research. So first, I'm going to talk about some really different topics related to digital journalism. And after I've talked about 10 topics, then I'm going to talk about 10 different researches and how did they do it? Like, what did they do to find things out, to answer their questions, right? Because research always begins with a question. Okay, so you're going to see screenshots of the top part of an article when I'm talking about it. And in case any of these articles are interesting to you and also related to your assignment that Pakdandi is going to give you, I put all these research articles in one folder in Dropbox. So you can all open up that folder and you can see in there the name of the author and the year. And that's also going to be on the slide. So you can download like just one article, or you can download, if you want all of them, you can take all of them. Okay, so remember I said two things, right? Two things. So this is number one, areas of research or topics for research about digital journalism. And these are not in any special order. What I want to do is just give you an idea about the kinds of things that a real researcher will investigate, will ask questions about, right? And have a published research article about this topic. So first, overall, and I'm going to summarize this a little bit differently from the way that it's written. I'm going to say areas of research in digital journalism are often about the digital news organization. So people will study, the online only news organization, or they'll study a newspaper's online presence or a newspaper's use of social media, something like that. Another common thing is they'll study the audience for journalism. How do the users or the readers or the people who consume the journalism, how do they do it? What do they think about it? Why do they read what they read? And why do they not read some other things, right? So research about the audience. Then there's also research about the journalists themselves, the people who do journalism, right? So some researchers will study. Somebody's mic's on.
Yeah, I already mute him.
Okay. So some people will study how the journalists do their work and also like their attitudes toward news and their audience and so forth. People study the news itself. They'll study the content of the news. I don't even have this listed here, but some research is done about the technologies behind the digital platforms and so forth. So there are a lot of areas, and now we'll get into some specifics. There we go. Oh, not quite yet. Not specifics yet. Okay, so a few things to keep in mind, right? Most journalism is digital now in some way, right? And journalists are using computers and cell phones, mobile phones, and social networks. So most journalism is digital. So sometimes a research about just journalism will also apply to digital journalism. Research about social media, about platforms, might be about journalism, but then there's some research that's only about the social media and not about news, right? So either way. Misinformation is often about topics in the news. So there are a lot of studies about fake news and about misinformation and disinformation, right? Digital journalism is constantly changing, right? Every 2-3 years, something new is happening. Something has changed a lot from just 3 years or 4 years earlier. And this means that the research from 5 years ago, even that early, 5 years ago, the research from that time might not be relevant today. So, and actually another part of this is that if you find a research article in a journal, and the journal is from today, from November 2021, if you look carefully, you'll probably see that the research activities were done much earlier, maybe even 3 or 4 years ago. So the journal article that is published today might be about things that were happening in 2018 or 2017. So you really can't go back far, far, far in the research and the journals, because you're going to be reading about stuff when the internet was different, when we didn't have social media, when we didn't have so much fake news. You can't look at an article that was published in 2008 and think that it applies perfectly to today, because it won't. 1 second, I see there's a couple things. Hang on 1 second. I want to see the chat window, and I realized it's closed. There we go. I'm opening it up so I can see it. Oh, okay, just the link. All right, good. Okay, now next. All right, now we get to the example. So to repeat what I'd said, I'm going to show you 10 topics, and I'm going to talk briefly about each topic. They're all really different from each other. And then after the topics, I will talk about some research methods that are used, different kinds of methods that researchers use. So first example, this is an example of how many people, I can't really see all of you, but how many people see content from AJ Plus, right? Not Al Jazeera, but AJ Plus. It's a different, it's a part, it's like a, what do they call it? It's not part of Al Jazeera, but it is. It's kind of like a separate business, and they operate differently, right? That's why they have a different name. So AJ Plus doesn't really, it doesn't have a TV channel. It doesn't have a website, really. It kind of does, but not really. AJ Plus produces videos and other like social content, and they publish on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, and those are, AJ Plus is designed to share news via these platforms. That's what it was created to do, right? So this research by a researcher named Mohammed Zayani, and he's done a lot of really interesting research about digital media. He did a research about the strategies of AJ Plus. So that's his topic, right? He looked at one news organization that is digital only, and he examined their strategies for getting an audience, for sharing the news, for how their journalists work, and so on. So that's one topic. That's his topic, right? So you could have another study of a different online only news organization, and it could be conducted, the research could be conducted in the same way as Zayani conducted this research, right? So a topic is a focus on one news organization. Oh, and I forgot. Yeah, I have 2 screens for each article, right? So this is kind of a summary, right? An in-depth study of their strategies. And I put in one quote to point out, in case you don't know, AJ Plus focuses on a young audience. They expect you to be looking at their content on your phone. So that's the audience that they're aiming at. Now, second example out of 10, right? Number 2 is, this is an article that's all about fake news, but it's not giving us examples of fake news. The researchers were trying to figure out, are there different categories of fake news? And the reason that you do this, or that researchers would want to figure out, are there categories? Can I name them? Can I define what differentiates one category of fake news from a different category? And can I talk about a kind of a continuum? Okay, within this category, there's really bad fake news of that kind, and there's not so bad, right? So these researchers were basically constructing a kind of model so that other researchers could use their model to evaluate different kinds of fake news. So this is a very, very scholarly, these are scholars who are thinking big thoughts, really smart people, right? The first author on this, Edson Tandok, I've heard him speak. He's really smart. He's at NUS in Singapore. I think NUS or the other one. And he's published quite a lot about digital journalism. So the researchers figured out 6 different categories, and then they figured out how you could measure a degree of kind of fakeness or factualness. And they also thought that you should take into consideration whether the person or the organization that shared the fake news, whether they intended to deceive people, right? Or was it just an accident? They didn't know it was fake news. So this research was all about, really thinking deep thoughts about fake news. Now, completely different. This is a paper, a conference paper, but it's very well written. It's very well researched, and it is about Rappler. Are you all familiar with Rappler? Right? They have a big bureau in Indonesia. They do a lot of news about Indonesia, but their home is Manila in the Philippines. And their founder, Maria Ressa, she just won a Nobel Prize. I think the Peace Prize, right? Because there's not a Nobel Prize for journalism. Anyway, so Rappler is very famous. They have a big presence in Indonesia. And so this paper is about the business model for the digital news organization named Rappler. So the business model is, how do they make money? How do they pay their journalists? How do they keep surviving year after year? Because often this kind of organization doesn't have any advertising. And why don't they have advertising? Well, because they are challenging the people in power. And the advertisers don't want to give them money, because the advertisers want to stay on the good side of the people in power, right? Particularly in the Philippines right now. So They are not for profit, and they have all these ways that they make money and they keep their business going. And so these researchers studied the business model for this one digital news organization, right? Let's see. Right. And then toward the end of this research, the authors talk about whether the model of Rappler, the business model, could be used in other parts of Southeast Asia, right? Because the Philippines is Southeast Asia, they have a bureau in Indonesia. So could a digital news organization like Rappler be established somewhere else, right? Like Malaysia or Myanmar or Thailand, right? Somewhere else in Southeast Asia. Or is it just special to the Philippines, right? So the researchers thought a little bit about that and, gave their assessment in their paper. Okay, now, something else completely different. How do you study WhatsApp? You all use WhatsApp, you share news on WhatsApp, but how can researchers make a study of WhatsApp? Well, these researchers did. They figured out a way to do it. And now, one thing about these researchers, they are in Chile in South America. And you guys might be starting to tune me out right now and say, I don't care about South America. It's far away. There's people over there. They're not Asian. They're not like us. Well, guess what? They're all on WhatsApp. They love WhatsApp just as much as Indonesians do, right? And they have a lot of misinformation and they have different media challenges that are very similar to the challenges you face in Indonesia. So sometimes young people, they see a research about a faraway country that's not very important in the world, not very important, they think, right? And they say, Chile, I don't know about that country. I don't want to read about them. But the point of this research is people in Chile, regular people, are sharing information about elections and politics, and they're sharing fake news, and they're doing it all on WhatsApp. So if you look at what the researchers studied and what they learned about how people share news on WhatsApp in Chile, you can actually think that some things are very similar in your own country. So I always like to make that point that don't have a closed mind when you see a research is about some country that you think is not very important or a country that you think is so different from your country. If they're writing about digital journalism and you want to learn about digital journalism, you might learn something really interesting from their research. Now, this one, let's see, I have to remember what this one's about. Oh, right. This was interesting. Actually, I thought all these were interesting. But so these researchers were thinking about clickbait and how so many news organizations are just focused on getting more clicks. And the researchers were asking themselves, they said, is it wrong to be so focused on clicks? Because what are the people, the users in the audience, people in the audience, if they're on your website, if they're using your news app and they don't click on something, does that mean it didn't make any impression on them? And they also thought if they do click on it, does that always mean that they are very interested in that thing? So these researchers wanted to study why people click what they click and also why they don't click what they don't click. So it's a pretty neat way that they actually watched people. They went to people's homes. So the researchers went into a private home And they asked people, of course, they made arrangements ahead of time. They said, use whatever device you want. If you like to get news on your phone, use your phone. If you like to get news on a tablet, use your tablet. And we're going to sit here and watch you. And we would like you to talk out loud while you're doing your normal news browsing. And then the researchers would make notes and ask questions. And this was how they studied. What do people click and why? And what don't they click and why? And I'll just give you one specific thing out of this article that I thought was interesting. So they saw somebody just go right past a very big news story about Syria. You know, there's a war and there's refugees. And so this person just like scrolled right past it. They didn't click, they didn't. And so the researcher said, why did you skip that? Why didn't you click on that? And the person said, oh, I'm so tired of all that bad news from Syria. I just can't read anymore. Now, it's a very normal thing, right? But the researchers are, you know, figuring out, okay, so the person noticed it and the person made a decision. I don't want to read any more about Syria. So that was the kind of research that this is. Okay, something else altogether different. And this is another one that I think a lot of people in Asia, they would see that this study was conducted in Europe. And well, I'm going to read the countries. Okay, so France, Germany, Japan, Spain, the UK, and the US. So those are the 6 countries. So, okay, Japan's in Asia, but nothing in Southeast Asia. And, you know, Japan is a really, really different country from Indonesia. So you might say, I can't learn anything if I read this. But the article is about how can we get people to pay for online news? And it's a comparison of the differences in the 6 countries that were studied. So when you're looking at this kind of article, you can get ideas first about how people in Indonesia might be convinced to pay for news. And also, if you are a researcher, or maybe you aren't now, but someday maybe you will be, maybe this is a research that you could do about countries closer to home, right? So I think there's a lot to learn from an article about this, because everybody in the news business is interested in getting people to pay for online news, right? This is a very hot topic among media professionals, right? So this article, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't answer everything, right? But it shows that there are differences in these 6 different countries about what people would pay for and why they would pay for it. So let's go to our next example. All right. So this one is really unusual. And I liked it because it's really different, really unusual. This researcher, this one guy, this is a single author on this paper, he wanted to study how data journalists learn things from what he calls civic technologists. And I'll explain that. What is a civic technologist? Well, this is like a programmer or a tech person who creates tools to help the public sort of like get more democracy, be more involved, with civic society, social organizations, that kind of thing. So there are people not in journalism who are technologists who build things, digital tools, to help the public be better informed or to share their issues with people in power and so forth. But they're not journalists. They're building tools for the public. This researcher studied how some journalists meet up with those technologists and they learn from each other. So the journalists, maybe they also learn how to build tools themselves. but maybe they just learn about the tools, and then maybe the journalists use the tools themselves in their journalism. It goes the other way too. The technologists may learn from the journalists. So this was the kind of study that this person did, right? His whole study was conducted in one city, Berlin, in Germany. But he found these people were working together and sharing information, and he thought it was interesting. So he made a study about them, the journalists and the technologists, and what they learned from each other. Very unusual, but I thought it was a pretty neat idea. Last week, I showed you an example of this. I showed you how a public radio news organization in the US used a map of their city so that people could report bad roads, holes in the road, what we call potholes. And they could report them by just clicking a place on the map and saying, there is a hole in the road here. So I showed this last week. This tool, this map, was built by Civic Technologists, what this researcher calls a civic technologist, right? So the journalists did not build the map. They didn't build this database, but they, oh, somebody's mic is on. So the journalists used this tool. They worked together with the people who made the tool, and they publicized it through their news organization. So we talked about this last week, and it's an example of what's written about in this article, even though this map was in the US and this research is in Germany. Okay, so let me remember what this one is. Oh yeah, this was, okay. This was an article that I didn't think I was going to use it at first, because the beginning of the article is talking about all this stuff that's, how to say this? It's a little bit interesting to me, but it wasn't about, you know, studying something directly that was useful. That's the beginning of the article. But then, as the article went on, as I skimmed and skipped a lot, I got to the point, well, what did these two researchers really do? And I started reading about how they studied the way some college students, university students in the US, in the UK, in France, and in Russia, so students at different universities, how they come across news randomly, right? Because a university student doesn't sit down with their phone and say, I'm going to look for some news now. That's not what you think, right? It's like, I'm going to look at Snapchat. I'm going to look at Instagram. You know, I'm going to, you know, look at stuff on my phone. But while you're doing that, you might come across some news. So the study here is actually about the students identifying the news items that they noticed when they're just doing what they normally do with their platforms and their apps. And I thought it was an interesting way to study it too, because the researchers asked the students to keep a diary. So the students would write down any news item that caught their interest, right? They would write where they saw it, what platform, what it was, and this was the research that was done here. So the researchers had students from 4 different countries, and I forget if it was only 4 universities or it was, I think it was 2 universities in Russia. And anyway, so they studied, what do the students call news? Like when the student said, I saw a news item about this. And I'll give you one example. One of the students wrote down, I saw a news item where my friend got a new puppy. My friend got a new puppy. Now, you know that was not published by a news organization, right? But the student, in the mind of this young person, maybe 19 or 20 years old, he considered this to be news. It was news to him. So in his diary, he wrote, I saw a news item, right? My friend, or I forget if it was his cousin or his friend, got a new dog. So this was also part of what the journalists learned here, was that what the young people consider to be news is not only news that comes from a journalism organization or a journalist, right? Sometimes they consider news to be something that just came from somebody they know in everyday life. So I thought this was pretty interesting. Now, this one's a little hard, but I can explain what we're talking about if you will think about Netflix. So if you use Netflix, or you know somebody who does, when you first open it up, it's going to recommend some things to you, right? There's always a part that says, here's some stuff that we recommend for you, some TV series or some movies or whatever, some comedies recommended for you. Amazon does the same thing. Here's recommended to you, right? So how do those recommendations happen? Well, it's software, right? It's an algorithm. So there are computer programs that are churning through all of our data, and everything we watch, everything I watch, everything you watch, and they're putting things together, and they're saying, people like Mindy like this kind of TV show. So we're going to tell Mindy that she might like this TV show, right? Okay, so news can be recommended the same way. And you might not realize it, but many news organizations already have this kind of software running their website. So in the old days, when you bought a printed newspaper, every story on the front page of the newspaper was placed in that exact position on page 1 by a human being. And they had meetings about it, and they discussed it, and they said, how big should the headline be? How big should the photo be? Should this one be above or below? All that was done by people arguing and discussing and making judgments. But nowadays, on some of the big news websites, no people are talking about that at all. An algorithm, a software program, is saying, okay, these are going to go at the top and these are going to be below. These stories are going to be big and have a big headline. These stories will be on the side and they will be small. And also, the page on the phone or the screen that I see when I go to that news website, it might have different things on it if you go to the exact same website. And it is because the algorithm is choosing what we see, just like Facebook, right? You've heard about Facebook's algorithm. So what is this research about? This research is about how journalists feel about that. What are the opinions of the journalists about software programs picking which news goes on the top and which news is important? So that's the research that these people did. And you see how all my examples of topics, they're all really different from each other. There's just so much that we can study today because there's just so many things going on. And I think this might be my last topic of topics. So this was a study that was conducted in 2 places, Hong Kong and Singapore. And what this researcher wanted to look at was the roles that both online and offline news organizations play in a country where there are restrictions on freedom of speech and restrictions on media, restrictions on the journalists, right? So what this researcher wanted to look at is, what do journalists consider to be the role of these media organizations in a place like Singapore and a place like Hong Kong? And all the journalists that were interviewed were either journalists in Hong Kong or journalists in Singapore, right? So they were local to those places. So this was a research where everything that was done was interviews with working professional journalists. So I think, yes. So those are my 10 examples of topics about digital journalism. They're not the only topics, right? And each of them, by showing you individual articles, I'm being very specific. But that kind of article could be written about a different place or a different news organization or journalists at a different place or so forth, right? So I summarize the topics on this page. And I'm not going to read each line because that would be pretty boring. But I am going to point out that when I started, before I showed you topics, I talked about, you can do research about journalists, you can do research about audience, blah, blah. But this is a little bit different way to look at it because these are actually the 10 that I showed you, right? So these are the actual 10 examples that I gave you. And you can see number 4, 5, and 6. Those are all about how do users act? How does the audience behave? What does the audience do with news? So that's a kind of research that we can do, right? Number 9, journalists' attitudes. Now, in this case, it was journalists' attitudes toward the recommender algorithm. But you can do studies about journalists' attitudes toward fake news, journalists' attitudes toward using social media platforms, right? So there are a lot of studies about what do journalists think about something. We saw a business model research. We saw a strategy research. We saw a research about fake news. And we saw at least a couple of articles that were about news work, right? Not just journalist attitudes, but actually how do they do their jobs? What do they do on their jobs? So that's another type of research or a research topic. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and take a sip of my tea because we're going to move now from topics to methods. So before we switch, think for a moment about, okay, what we just talked about for most of my lecture up until now was topics for research, okay? We're going to change in a moment. Okay. Methodology. That is methods for doing the research, right? So when you want to study X, whatever X is, right? You want to study something about digital journalism. How do you study it? How do you get answers to your questions? So research begins with questions. You know, the researcher is saying, I wonder what the business model is for Rappler. I wonder what journalists think about news recommendation systems. I wonder why people click on stuff and they don't click on other stuff, right? So the researcher begins with a question. And then their next step is they have to figure out, well, if I want to answer my question, how can I get an answer to that question? What do I have to do? I have to collect some kind of data, right? I have to collect information. That's how I answer a question. So how? What are they going to do? So a similar slide to what we saw for topics, but this one is for methods, right? So different kinds of methods are used. Interviews. That's something that researchers have in common with journalists, but the kind of interviews that researchers do are usually more structured. They are more planned in advance because they're probably going to interview, like if you interview 30 journalists about a topic, you want to make sure that you ask them all the same questions, basically. So that's what we mean about a structured interview. Content analysis is a system of looking at content like news articles or social media posts, any kind of content that you pick. And you're going to look at that content in a very sort of a planned and organized way. You're not just going to read it and make notes about it. You're going to examine it for certain predetermined points, and you're going to have like basically a checklist, and you're going to, and then later you will look at all the things you checked and didn't check, and you'll run statistics on what you found about the content. Surveys and questionnaires you're all familiar with. Limited ethnography, I'll talk about in a little bit with an example. But ethnography is, you may know what that is. You may know what anthropology is, right? When an anthropologist goes into the field and studies a culture. So people do this with newsrooms. They go into a newsroom and they study the culture in the newsroom. The reason I call it limited ethnography is that if an anthropologist goes and studies a culture, the anthropologist will like live there for 6 months or a year and be there like every day and take notes and observe everything. When researchers observe a journalism organization, they don't stay for 6 months. They often go for as little as 2 weeks or maybe 1 month, right? Where they go to the newsroom every day and they make their observations. So it's limited, but it's still observations of that culture, that environment.
Kapan ke sana? Udah ada ininya belum?
Online lah, tilu sasi.
Oh gitu.
Dadang, your mic is on.
Yeah,
Okay.
I already mute him. I muted the dean. Oh
Hi.
I know.
Hi, Mindy.
So another kind of method, right? Experiment. This is one of the most fun ones, I think, to read about, but it's one of the hardest to do. And I had a student once who did an experiment for his PhD dissertation. And he made, can I describe this briefly? He took different YouTube, he did take them from YouTube. He took news stories about things that were happening in the Arab world. He was a guy from Kuwait. And he took news stories from Al Jazeera and he took news stories from CNN, but he changed the labels on them. So he changed the videos with video editing. And then he had people come in and watch the CNN video, but it said it was from Al Jazeera. And then other people watched the CNN video and it said it was from CNN. Another group of people watched the Al Jazeera video and it said it was from CNN. And another group watched the Al Jazeera video and it said it was from Al Jazeera. So that's an experiment where you have 4 groups of people in that case watch. Each group watches a different video. And then after they watch it, they answer questions about, for example, was it biased? Right? And of course, you find that a lot of people think it's biased if it's from the news organization that they think is more trustworthy or less trustworthy. And anyway, that's an example of an experiment. We'll see 2 more examples coming up. Case studies are often done about one organization, kind of describing how they work, what they do. And computational analysis, I only gave 2 examples. I'm not going to explain them in depth. They're complicated, but there are now various methods that use computational analysis. And often a communications researcher works together with a computer scientist to produce this kind of research. In other words, the communications or journalism researcher doesn't know how to use the computational analysis, but they work with somebody else who does know how to do that. So one thing to keep in mind, a lot of beginners, right? Young people like yourself, as Satu, you don't have a full, complete idea of research yet. So you might think, I would do a research when I just go out and I count things. Like maybe I count how many news articles are biased in this particular news website and how many are not biased. And then I make a report about that. That's too simple. That's not actually research, right? So real research has to have some kind of analysis. So you can't just count things. So often, if there is something that you can count after it's counted, then you run statistical analysis on what you counted, right? So it's not enough to just count something. You also have to analyze your findings. What did you collect the data? Then you analyze what you got. So methods, right? These are going to be examples of methods for doing research, right? So before we talked about topics, now I'm going to give you examples of different methods. Okay, so same basic idea, right? So here's an article. The name of the article is News in Social Media, right? Sounds great. The researchers wanted to study how, let me think how to say this. Do young people, when they're consuming news, do they rely on opinion leaders? Do they identify some people or accounts or influencers as opinion leaders? And then do they pay more attention to them? That's basically what the researchers wanted to find out. So how did they study this, right? Remember, we're talking about methods. So this is all about how, right? This part of the lecture. So how was first these two researchers, they had access to a big national survey that answered some of their questions. So they took the national survey that was published and they could get access to it. And they took out the young age group, people from 16 to 25. And they looked at the questions that were about using news and getting information. So they had they had data about that age group for almost 700 people in that young age group. But then, based on what they learned from analyzing that bigger data set, then the researchers went to secondary schools, high schools, and they interviewed students in small groups of like 4 to 7 high school students, and they interviewed them to learn more about, how do young people decide what they can trust or what they want to look at, and do opinion leaders play some role in that, right? But the point here, because we're talking about methods, is these researchers used two things. They used a big survey that they didn't do themselves. It was a survey that already existed from their government. And then after that, they went and they did qualitative interviews with a small number of students, 44 students. So they mixed two things together. We often call that mixed methods. But you often see this where there's like a survey with a lot of people, and then there's interviews with a smaller group of people. It's a very common method for doing social science research. Now, completely different method, right? And look at the title first, right? Presenting news on social media. So you want to study that, right? And more than that, you want to see the communication style of newspapers on Facebook. So these people, they actually wanted to study when a news organization, actually not just a news organ, a newspaper, when a newspaper posts an article on Facebook and they write a status about that article, these guys wanted to look at the status that they write. How different is it, or how similar to the headline and the lead of the actual article? So how would they study that? Okay. Well, first they had to collect a lot of Facebook posts. And look at that number I have underlined. They collected almost 300,000 Facebook posts. How did they do that? They didn't do it with their fingers. They did not copy paste, right? That would take a million years, right? So how did they do that? I didn't write this here, but this is in the article. They used a tool that's built into Facebook called, I think it's called Facebook Graph. And it's changed now. And I don't even know if you could do this research now, but at the time, they were able to use a tool from Facebook to download all these Facebook posts from newspapers' Facebook pages, right? So they collected these Facebook posts specifically from 9 newspapers. And the 9 newspapers were in the Netherlands and in Belgium, right? So that's where these researchers are from. So that's what they picked, right? And then how are you going to look at 300,000 Facebook posts? Well, you're not, right? Because again, it would take 1,000 years to get through it all, right? So they used a computational technique. They used, it's actually a kind of artificial intelligence called natural language processing. So there was, a computer program that was able to analyze the language in the status message and in the headline and in the lead of the article, right? And compare the two. So they actually did their study computationally. They didn't have to read the Facebook posts themselves. So I think that's pretty cool. I don't know how to do that, but I think it's a really interesting thing. And again, we're focused on methods here, so I don't even remember what they found out, but this is how. How did they do their study? This is how. This is their method. Okay, so this one. So people wanted to look at live blogging and see how different it was from sort of the regular news story that's published about the event separately from the live blog, right? So, and last week I talked about how it's not really live blogging anymore because we don't have blogs, but there's like streaming reports, live reports. Some organizations might do them on Twitter. Some organizations might do them on Facebook. Some organizations will do them on a dedicated page on their website, right? One that I always pay attention to is anytime we have an election in the US, the Washington Post and the New York Times will both do like live reporting on like one page on their website. And I like to open up both and like look at them at the same time and compare them because I'm just a nerd. Anyway, so these guys wanted to compare the actual contents of the live blog with a regular story about the same event, right? So that's what they wanted to do. So how did they study this? This is how, right? So they collected reporting about 15 live events. So for those 15 live events, they collected both live reporting and the story that came after from, from 3 UK organizations, BBC, The Guardian, and The Telegraph. So they had 15 events. They had 3 news organizations. They collected all this stuff. I'll talk about the numbers in a second. And also, they wanted to have some kind of, similarity for comparison. So some of the events were political elections. Some of the events were sports, probably, football and Man United, right? Something like that. And some of the events were a crisis. So we often see live reporting, live streaming. If there's a fire, if there's a street protest, if there's an earthquake, So they had these 3 categories. So all their 15 live events were in one of the 3 categories, right? So they're trying to manage, are things really different from each other, or are they the same or whatever? And in the end, about those 15 events, they had collected 45 live coverage, live blogs, and 473 news articles that were done, after the fact, right? And then they went through all that material, right? 45 plus 473, using a traditional content analysis, which is very time consuming. You've got, people just like doing it on paper, basically, right? Analyzing using a code sheet, and then afterwards running analysis on what they coded from their content analysis. So for those of you who are, young and haven't done any research yet and don't know a lot about it, content analysis is a very specific technique. There are books written about it. Like, you can learn how to do it by reading a book, right? So it's a specific thing. Okay, next example of methods, all right? So this was a study about fake news. And people analyzed sites that published false and misleading or information. And what I really liked about this article was these 2 researchers wrote in detail about their method. Some research articles only have a really short section, how they did it, right? This particular article is like a book about how to do the same thing. They went through every step they took about how did they select the sites that were known for publishing fake news. That was their first step. Then they took 50 sites out of the bigger collection of all the sites they identified, right? Then, after they identified which sites they're going to use, after that, then they collected actual individual articles from those sites, right? So they collected news items from the 50 sites over a 2-week period. And they used what's called a randomly constructed week, which I'm not going to go into, but again, that's a specific research thing. But they got all these articles from the 50 sites, and notice the number, 3rd line from the bottom, almost 25,000 articles, right? So they collected 25,000 articles from 50 websites that are known to publish mostly fake news and misinformation, right? They were not going to use computational analysis. They were going to use a traditional content analysis. So they couldn't look at all 25,000. So once they had the 25,000, then from that, they randomly selected 398 of those news items, and then they analyzed those. So I know that's kind of deep in the weeds, kind of a lot of detail, but, when you wonder, well, why should I trust that research? Aren't they just writing their opinion? No, not at all. There is actually a science to this. There is a science to how they selected the websites. There's a science to how they selected the articles. And then there's a science to how they analyze the articles. So that's one more method example. Now, let's see. I'm trying to remember how this one is. Oh, right. This is also about news recommendations. Only in the topics, when I talked about news recommendations, that research was about journalists' attitudes toward the recommender systems. This research is about audience attitudes toward news recommendation systems. So how did they do this? What is their method, right? So these researchers wanted to find out what audience think about 3 different types of recommendation systems. And to make this really easy, I can explain two really briefly. One type of news recommendation system is more like Netflix. It's going to show you more of what you already liked. So things that you read before, things that you read all the way to the end, things that you click the like button on, it's going to show you more and more and more of that, whatever that is, right? That's one kind of recommender. But there's actually another kind of recommender or recommendation system that tries to give you a more diverse selection, right? So it's deliberately not only giving you things like you already like, it's trying to like broaden your scope. So these researchers wanted to find out what people thought about those two, and then a third type I won't go into, right? And so what did they do? They conducted a survey of 943 people, all in one city. So they had a lot of different age groups, and then they looked at, age groups and gender and so forth to see, if people were different because they were men and women or old, young, or whatever. But they asked them questions on a survey about how people would feel about a recommendation system of one kind, the other kind, and a third kind. And then they ran a statistical analysis on their survey results. Okay, so this one I like because it's a case study. And I usually enjoy reading case studies because they're often written very much like a story. They can be interesting to read. And I wanted to point out, too, that this case study is about a citizen journalism organization or effort in a rural area of India. And I want to point out again, like I had spoken before about what country was I talking about? Chile, right? You might think, why would I read something about Chile, right? In this case, you might think, why would I read something about India? I don't care about India. Well, but the situation that they're describing is a situation that we might find in any developing country. And that is, there's a big rural area where a lot of people are poor, and there's not much journalism for them or about them. So people got together and probably, with some NGOs and so forth, to try to figure out a way that these people in this rural area, farmers and so on, that they can tell their stories, that they can share their stories with others, and that they can share their stories with each other, right? So a typical kind of citizen journalism initiative. So how did they do it? What's their method, right? They mostly used qualitative interviews. And who did they interview? Well, there's a part about the study I didn't mention yet. These researchers actually wanted to find out, how do professional journalists feel about these citizen journalists? So most of their qualitative interviews were with professional journalists who work in that exact area of India where this citizen journalism group operates. But one of their longest interviews was with the founder of the Citizen Journalism Initiative, right? So they only interviewed 10 local journalists plus the founder. And then they also, read a lot about reports about the Citizen Journalism Initiative. So they described they did a case study. They described how it started, what it did, who was involved. And then they added to that these interviews about journalists' attitudes toward the citizen journalists. So that's how they did it. Let's see, which one is this? Fake news. Oh, yes, I like this because, it's hard to study WhatsApp, right? Because it's not public. Like you can't go into WhatsApp and gather up people's messages because they're private, right? And yet you've got a whole country that's that's addicted to WhatsApp, and you're sharing all this information on WhatsApp. So how can a communications researcher study this, right? So, I had one under topics, and now I have another one. People actually do study WhatsApp, right? The one was from Chile, right? This one, let's see, this one is from Costa Rica, another South American country that Indonesians probably can't even point it out on the map. A lot of Americans can't point it out on the map. It's a very, very small country, right? But they're crazy about WhatsApp. Everybody in the country loves it. They use it. They share all this information. It's a big deal, right? And there was a lot of fake news about COVID on WhatsApp in this country. So the researchers want to study that, because how can you fight it if you haven't studied it, if you don't know how it works, right? So how did they study it? Okay. They used an experiment. So this is the first of my two examples of an experiment as a method. Okay. So their experiment was they got over 800 people, but they divided them into 3 groups. And the researchers constructed 5 news items. 2 of them were completely fake. 2 of them were partly fake, and 1 was completely true. So they had the people in all 3 groups read all 3 items. I'm sorry, all 5. So everybody read 5 items. They were short, right? Everybody read the same 5 things. But what was different among the 3 groups of, the 800 people divided by 3, each group was given different instructions before they got the 5 articles to read. And one of the instructions was about read these articles and tell us which ones you would share on WhatsApp. The other 2 groups were given different instructions, right? And then they did a statistical analysis on what people decided to share and what they didn't decide to share and what the other groups did and so forth. So that was how they didn't actually use messages from WhatsApp, but they made sure of the 800 people, this is detailed in their study, in their article, they made sure that all these people were regular users of WhatsApp. If anybody in their group said they didn't use WhatsApp, they sent them home, right? So they're 800 people, they were all big users of WhatsApp, and that was part of what they studied. So next example, okay, aggregation, clickbait, okay, journalistic credibility, all really great topics, right? So how are they going to study this? How are you going to study what audiences think about clickbait headlines and aggregated stories, right? What's a good way to study that? Well, this one is also an experiment. So these researchers did 2 studies, and this was a neat thing. They did the second study because the first study kind of left them with more questions. So they did one study. They probably thought they were only going to do the one. And in that first study, they had people divided into 4 groups. People in group 1, all the people got basically the same story, but it had differences. So people in group 1 got an original news story with a traditional headline. People in group 2 got the original story, nice normal story, but with a clickbait headline. People in group 3 got an aggregated story, not the original story, but kind of a conglomeration from different places with a traditional headline. And group 4 got the aggregated story with a clickbait headline. So 4 is kind of like the least journalistic version, or the least sort of traditional, right? And then they answered questions, people in the 4 groups, then there was an analysis. Well, that left the researchers with some additional questions after they'd done all that analysis. So then they did study 2, which I didn't talk about because I ran out of space. But study 2 was also a different experiment, but it was based on, the researchers were still curious after they finished study 1. So they did a study 2, and then they put them together in one article. This one. Okay. So this was, oh, this was nice too. I really like all these articles actually. So Quartz is a digital only, web only, app mainly. There's a website. They cover business news, technology news, but they're a very high quality news organization. They're digital only, and they're very like digital savvy, right? So I'm really familiar with them. The other one, El Confidencial, that is Spanish. I don't know anything about them. They are based in Spain. Their articles are on Spanish. I don't know anything about them, but the researchers are in Spain. So these researchers wanted to study two digital news organizations in two countries of very high quality. That's what they wanted to study, right? So how did they pick these two, right? And also what they wanted to study was, this is like a study about news work, about what happens inside the news organization. They wanted to study how these two news organizations develop a culture of innovation and how their leadership supports that innovative spirit and so forth. So they did two separate case studies, right? One of each news organization. And what they did was they used participant observation. So this is an ethnographic technique where you embed yourself in the news organization. And I mentioned this back at the beginning of the methods section of the lecture. A real anthropologist would spend months or even years with the culture that she was studying. But communications researchers usually spend 2 weeks or maybe a month, if they're lucky, embedded in the organization they're studying. But that was how these researchers studied the two newsrooms. They went and they actually stayed in the newsroom day after day after day, like all day long, and observed what was going on in the newsroom, right? They watched the journalists do their work, and they did what an anthropologist does. They kept a fieldwork diary while they were in the newsroom. So that is how they did their case study, and then they compared the two newsrooms and so forth. I definitely wanted at least one example of participant observation or an ethnographic approach, because this is a common method for studying what goes on in a digital newsroom, right? The researcher actually goes and sits in the newsroom and watches people work for days or weeks at a time. Okay, and I believe this is my last one. And I had to throw this one in because this is an example of two researchers who are really interested in new methods. So they are both very mature, established communications researchers. They've both won lots of awards. They're very highly regarded. They're both Americans. I know Sue personally, and Chris Anderson. I know who he is. I don't know him. I think he's in England now, actually. I think he's at Leeds or one of the British universities. Anyway, both of them are really, really great researchers, and their interest, their focus is on sort of like at the community level, how do people get news and what's important to them about news, and how do they interact with journalists? And this study was one where they wanted to look at kind of the network of citizens and journalists and how news passes from one group to the other group, right? Because often before it's news that's reported by the official news organization, it begins as some sort of citizen journalism or a citizen initiative or something like that. And then gradually it finds its way to the professional journalists, and then they report about it, right? So that's what these two researchers are interested in. So this is a really kind of innovative method that they worked on together. And they actually did two separate studies. So Sue did a study in the city where she lives, which is a medium-sized city in the north central part of the US. And Chris Anderson lived in Philadelphia at that time. And so he did his research there. But what they used was a combination of ethnography, right? Not observation in a newsroom, but actually ethnography in a community, and network analysis, which is a way of mapping connections between different people. So one way you can do a network analysis is you can, like on a platform like Twitter, you can map like who retweets who and who replies to who. That's one way of doing it. In a community, you're going to map like which organizations talk to which other organizations and which people do the journalists quote and interview. And you're going to map out like all the relationships among the news spreaders in the community, right? So these two researchers did their work where they combined these two methods together. And their article is mostly about their method. It's also about what they learned about their communities, but because their method is new and unusual, and they both learned things about it in their separate studies, and then they came together and discussed how it works, this is really an article about how to develop a new method, which is actually pretty exciting. So I think this is my last example of methods, is it? Yes. So I have offered you 10 completely different articles where I mainly discuss the methods, right? I had to talk a little bit about the topics because, like, what are they studying? But to summarize those 10 distinct articles that I talked about for methodology, we had a couple of surveys. We had a couple that were content analysis. We had one that was purely a case study. We had another one that had 2 case studies. We had 2 experiments. So in the 10 articles I just showed you about methodology, or to talk about methodology, this is a summary of what we saw. And for the young and inexperienced out there, when you see N equals and then a number, that means the number of people, right? Or the number of items. So if I say survey N equals 687, that means the valid survey responses was 687 responses, right? When the survey at number 5, survey N equals 943, 943 people were answered that survey, and their responses were accepted, were valid. Whenever you have qualitative interviews, you are going to have a much smaller N, a much smaller number of people, right? Because interviews take a lot longer. So survey numbers should be in the hundreds or thousands, but qualitative will usually be as few as 10 or 20 will often be the number of interviews for qualitative interviews. So we're not going to look at these. I had collected other articles that I thought were really interested about digital journalism, and I made slides, but then it's like, you know, you can't look at articles forever, and we've already been talking for quite a while. So I want to leave time for questions, and so we are not going to look at these articles, so I'm just going to whip through these slides really fast like this. Whoops, well, I didn't have to do them that fast, but same idea, but without, you know, topics and methods described. So remember that there is a Dropbox link on these slides, and you've already got, let me post this for you one more time and I'll stop sharing. So I am gonna post again the link to the slides. If I can copy and paste here, my cursor's misbehaving. There we go. Copy and paste. There we go. So if you look at the slides, they're Google slides. You don't have to download them. You can just look at them live. But if you go to, I'll tell you exactly which slide it's on. As soon as my cursor comes back. The link to the Dropbox folder is on slide 9. Sembilan. And so in that Dropbox folder, there are 30 articles. So I only talked about 20 articles. So there's 10 bonus extra articles. And if Pakdandi has you do the assignment that I gave him, which when he looks at it, maybe he will decide to change it. I don't know if it's too hard for them or not. You know them and I don't.
It is. But don't worry about that. I love to torture them.
Huh? What's that?
I love to torture them, torture with assignments.
You like to give them a hard time?
Of course.
Anyway, the assignment that I wrote for you actually requires you to read one article out of this Dropbox folder, right? So only one. You can read any one you want, but the assignment says read one of these articles. So, and one other thing that you might not realize, I'm going to share my screen again, because I know that, S-SATU students may not really have much understanding of research. So I'm going to share my screen and point out one thing that you might not know. And that is, okay. Yes, I'm sharing. So let me see. Okay. Hang on. Okay, not that one. That's just one author. Okay, this is a good example. So I copied the top of the article, which is the title, Defining Fake News, subtitle, A Typology of Scholarly Definitions, and then the authors, right? And the authors are Edson Tandock, Zhang Wei Lim, Richard Ling, right? So when we cite an article, when we make a reference to the article, we're going to refer to it as Tandock, Lim, and Ling 2018, right? Because digital journalism is the name of the journal. 2018 is the year. So the way we refer to that is by the author's second name or last name and the year that it was published. So if we look in the Dropbox folder and I want to find this one first, and they're in alphabetical order, right? So I would have to look for Tandock, and oh, look, there's two. Because I love him so much, I showed 2 articles by him. So wait, where's my slide? So you need to know the year. If there's more than one author with the same name or the same author twice, right? You're going to look at the year. So this one is Tandock 2018. So if you look in the Dropbox folder and you want that one, you would pick this one, and that's the one you would download, right? So if you're going to look at the slides, which might be helpful, and you're saying, oh, I want to download this one. Well, the first author's last name is Rimban. And so you would go into the Dropbox folder and you would say, okay, Rimban, there's only one, so that must be that article. So now you know how to find an article that has been saved with a file name using the system that I use. And there's one in here that I never talked about, and I put it in here with the article title instead of the author's name, because that's a totally different thing. And if you wanted to look at that, that's different. But all the rest have the last name and the year, and that's how you would find them. All right, we're probably ready for your questions now.
Right, thank you very much, Mindy. Very interesting. Not too boring, so, but yeah, interesting.
Not too boring? I hope not too boring.
No.
I like it. I mean, I really like it. I don't like doing it, but I like reading it.
Right. So before we go to the questions, I just want to welcome some guests here in this meeting. So we have our long lost friend, Pak Adi Wibowo. Hi, Pak Adi.
Adi.
Say something. Say something. You're still muted, please. Oh, masih mute, Pak. Pak dulu.
Okay. Something.
Thank you.
Hai Mindy.
Hai Adi, apa kabar Pak?
Alhamdulillah baik. I'm fine.
Right. For those who doesn't know this person, so Pak Adi is actually our lost dosen. Yeah. Pak Adi taught in the Department of Journalism a long time ago, together with me in the special class called New Media Development. And then in 2012, I think we also have a collaboration with Ibu Mindy at the same class. So we three of us work together to teach new things in journalism for the students. So we have quite a good history in this department. So now I invited Pak Adi as well. Now Pak Adi teaches at the UNM ya, Universitas Multimedia Nusantara in Banten, Tangerang, sorry. Di mana sih? Di SDT di mana tuh teh?
Ya itu Banten dan Tangerang.
Banten dan Tangerang ya, oke. Daerah situlah. UMN ya. So Pak Adi is now teaching journalism as well and bring all the material from Mindy to that place. So you're a hijacker, right? Now I invited him to follow our discussion, and also I want to welcome two other guests. We have Pak Mulkan. Pak Mulkan ada ya? Pak Mulkan ya? Mulkan, are you monitoring our conversation, Pak Mulkan? Pak Mulkan and Ibu Isnaini, sorry. So they are actually lecturers from other university who now have kind of internship program here in Unpad, and they are teaching communication studies as well at their own universities. So thank you for participating in this class. And we also have some postgraduate students as well, just like last week. So don't worry about this research methodology, Mindy, because there are some master's students here who really needs enlightenment about the research methodology.
They need to learn research.
Yes. Right. I hope I didn't miss anyone else that's outside the class of journalism. All right. So please, guys, if you have some questions to bring up in this discussion, then don't hesitate. Just raise your hand or open your mic.
I see a question in the chat. Let me read it. Wait, let me close the participant window so I have more space.
Okay.
Wait, Anindita.
Anindita, okay. Well, it's also a question from, I call it Pak Syahid because you look like a Bapak, yeah. So, do you want to talk? Please just come open your mic.
No, okay. So I'm gonna answer. So Anindita in the chat has asked me about mixed methods, and I see a lot of studies where mixed methods are just perfect, right? Because you get information from a survey, right? And especially like if, you know, you have a lot of respondents and you do a proper statistical analysis and there's significant findings and so forth. But then basically what you have is this big sort of chart of numbers, right? And it says, oh yeah, you know, and you say, oh, in response to this research question, you know, more like this hypothesis was supported and this one wasn't. but it's kind of cold and dry, right? So mixed methods are often a survey plus qualitative interviews. And if it's done in a good way, like if the qualitative interviews are really done with kind of the right mix of people and the questions are good, deep questions, it really provides insight that just makes the whole research more interesting than a survey alone. Because I really dislike a study that's only a survey, because then you just get into the statistics and I just lose interest. I'm like, yeah, I don't really care what your numbers told you. but like using the survey results as a basis to then, sort of explore like real, feelings and thoughts of individuals. I think it makes a richer kind of a research. Does that answer your question, Anindita?
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Sama. Okay, so we have Shahid.
Shahid Lukman, yeah.
Shahid was here last week, right? He asked me a question. Yeah, I remember. Let's see. First thing, I apologize about my grammar. False news and hoaxes. Overlapping. You know what? Actually, that right there would be a really good study, right? So the example that I showed under topics, I think the second one by Tandock about fake news. Was it the second one or was it the first one? Second one. Yeah, defining fake news. So, what they were doing is they were trying to sort of figure out, are there different kinds of fake news? And this is a similar idea. Well, is a hoax something different from fake news? And like, this is a topic that you could do a research on, right? And like, it takes sort of a lot of, intellectual work. Like, well, how would I define fake news? Would I find examples? How would I support the fact that I'm saying this is fake news and this is not, but it's a hoax, and this is a hoax, but it's not fake news, right? Like, is there really a difference? And so if you could find a way to make definitions, right? To make categories, to sort of create a framework that someone else could also adopt and use to identify, is this thing fake news or is it a hoax? Then like that you would have a real research there. Now, I don't know, let me see. One of the things that these guys, I'm gonna put this up on the screen again, so just in case you forgot it, because it was a while ago, right? So this is the one I'm talking about right here, this one, defining fake news. Let me put that bit right. There we go. So these guys came up with 6 different categories of fake news. And to come up with categories, you have to define them in a way that, somebody else like me, I don't, know anything about their research, but I could read their article and I could say, okay, I'm going to collect some stories and I'm going to say, can I apply their category and say, this news item or this news story is in their category 1, and this other one is in their category 5, and this other one's in their category 6. If their categories are good enough that I can do that, then they made something useful that other researchers can use, right? And that is a legitimate kind of scholarship. So you would have to think about, now I'm going to unshare. Yeah. So you would have to think about how is a hoax different from fake news? And one of the things that those researchers came up with was an idea about the intention of the person who published or shared that fake news. So they had a kind of a scale of, okay, just like say your grandmother repeats something that she found on Facebook or on WhatsApp, and she really thinks it's true. She really believes it's true. So her intention is not bad, right? But then there's those Russians who tried to ruin the US election. Their intention was bad, right? They were sharing fake news about Joe Biden and all the other people who were on the Joe Biden side, right? They're sharing fake news about them to make them look bad. And they intentionally, they knew that the news was fake and they put it out there. Basically, they wanted to harm the election, right? They wanted to hurt the election. So that's an intention. Well, a hoax, I think maybe a hoax is always something where somebody had a bad intent, right? They intended to cause harm. They intended to deceive people, right? To lie to people, right? So not like your grandma making a mistake, right? So you can like sometimes look at that. And then fake news, you know, like these researchers, they like, you know, came up with 6 categories, and then within the categories, they had scales. So that might be an interesting article for you to look at. Now, when you said, I don't think you can use ethnography on fake news, right? Because ethnography is, you know, you go into a place like a town or a newsroom or a school, and you observe like all the people doing whatever they do there, right? So ethnography involves you observing actual people, right? Whereas fake news isn't people so much as it's content. So fake news is more of a content analysis thing and not an ethnography thing. Does that make sense? Is that good?
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So a long time ago, actually, Mindy, I thought that the advertorial is kind of fake news. You know, advertorial.
Wait, the what is?
The advertorial. So something like
advertorial,
news.
yeah.
But the inside actually is not news. It's an advertisement.
Yeah,
so,
and
so I
also
think
like, yeah, it's like a different kind of thing. Like an advertorial can be true.
Yeah.
It can be true and accurate, right? It's just the thing about an advertorial is somebody paid to place it there, right?
Right.
So that makes it more like an ad, right? So some company, like, you know, a car company paid for it. Like say it's an article about fossil fuels, right? Or climate change or something. Yeah. If you find out that a car company, an automobile company, like paid for that content, then you know they have a bias because their cars run on what do you guys call it? Benzene, right?
Yeah.
so their cars, you know, so like the car company really doesn't want to stop us from getting fossil fuels, right? They're in favor of fossil fuels. So if they paid for it, then it's probably biased, but it might not be false, right? It might not be fake.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
And maybe Pak Syahid, you can also learn about the 3 kind of the information disorder, like misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. I think.
What was the last one?
Malinformation is
mal. M-A-L.
Mal, M-A-L.
Oh yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Information. So.
Yeah. I was taught a long time ago. Disinformation is like the kind of thing that spies do. You know, like they carefully spread false information, but they have an intention of like kind of like an example would be, so say some group is planning a terrorist attack, but they're going to spread false information about maybe a wrong time or a wrong place. So it makes it easier for them to do their attack, something like that. So that would be disinformation. It's like deliberately false, and it's like part of a bigger plan. Whereas misinformation is often just meant to confuse people and make them not know what's right and wrong, or what's correct.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. If anyone else want to raise questions or discuss something, or maybe you disagree with Mindy about something,
you can disagree. It's fine with me.
Yeah, of course. So for you as satu people from the class of journalism, so this is maybe kind of high context of research you might not expect it before, but still the methodology and the research is really beneficial for us as a journalist. So when you're going to the field and doing some reporting stuff, you have to have the ability to do research like this, so you can comprehend the fact from field more easily. So if you have something to share here, please, because remember, after this, I will give you assignments about research.
Well, and also I was thinking too, like, do your students still write description?
Yes, still.
Yeah. And aren't they supposed to do a research for their description?
Right.
Yeah.
So,
well,
this is a good, good start,
right? So I was thinking about that when I wrote the assignment, right?
Yeah.
Because if, the assignment has two parts, and the first part is read one of the articles that I gave. But the second part is use that kind of topic and that kind of method and adapt it or change it to make it a research that you could do in Indonesia.
Yes, perfect.
And
usually they will start to do that next semester and next year. But it will be good if you can start now to practice.
Yeah, well, and it would get your mind working toward that thing that will be your scriptsy, which you have to do to graduate, right? So
yes.
If you can use this assignment as a way to sort of think in a new way or imagine a kind of a research that you could do, it might help you get a head start on your scriptsy.
Yes. Get it, guys? So you are ready for your scriptsy.
They're all avoiding thinking about it. They're all like, oh yeah, I'm not thinking about that till I have to.
You should. All right, maybe. Or maybe Pak Adi, you want to share something? So can Pak Adi bring your material to his place, Mindy?
Oh yeah.
See,
definitely.
I will give you the link then. It will be good for your students.
Oh yeah.
Okay, the other Adi, you want to say something? Oh, we have two Adis here. Pak Adi, do you want to say something? Right. All right. Anyone else? You can write down your question on the chat box, and don't worry about your English. Everybody understand you. But if you want to ask something in our language, so don't worry. I will translate it. Hopefully, I can translate it well.
Yeah, Dandi can translate for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully, I can. All right. let's see. All right, guys, I'm not sure that you're still there because your camera is off. But I have to make sure that you're there. So I want to ask Agung, Rama, Agung, are you still there?
There he is.
Kenal lo. Soalnya yang lain pada diam. Gimana, Gung? Do you think this class will have something to do with your work as journalists, especially in this semester? Apa materinya pas kan nih buat kerjaan kalian semester ini?
Maaf Pak, mungkin biar bahasa Indonesia dulu ya Pak. Jadi kurang lebih untuk materi yang minggu kemarin cukup baik Pak, apalagi yang tentang kurasi dan lain-lain itu. Cuman yang sekarang mungkin bisa dipakai untuk semester 6 dan 7 kali ya Pak, untuk persiapan seminar sama skripsi gitu Pak. Karena mungkin lebih ke arah sana gitu Pak, yang saya lihat di materi hari ini.
Okay. So Agung said that our material today is actually more have connection to what they will do next semester to create a research proposal before skripsi. But I think why I asked Mindy to explain it now, because we have a special theme for the research, that is the digital journalism. So this first this meeting will give you ideas about research related to digital journalism or online journalism, as you may call it, and that's it's my specialty as well. So if you have some idea to conduct some research about digital journalism after this meeting, so you can discuss with me or with Pak Gunggung and with Pak Andika, because we have the specialty on that kind of research. Secondly, the methods that you have heard from Mindy today, actually you can use it as journalists. So after this, maybe you will have to go to the field again. Ya, kalian harus ke lapangan lagi and make some kind of reporting. You can apply some simple research method to gather information from the field. And you're not only just writing down what you see on the field, but you can analyze what happened on the field. Ya, jadi nggak cuma nulis aja, nggak cuma membuat berita saja, tapi kalian juga bisa menganalisis ya dengan kemampuan kalian untuk menganalisis secara riset metodologi riset yang tadi diterangkan oleh Bu Mindy. So you can make your stories even more have kind of benefit for the readers. Ya, kamu bisa memberikan analisa lebih buat para pembaca kalian. Itu kira-kira ya, Bung ya. Mudah-mudahan berguna loh.
Tapi nggak tahu di mana. Tapi nggak tahu hari Minggu ya di Got enggak itu. Di Got.
Ya. He's talking about something else. Nokia 5.3. Who is this? All right. Anyone else, guys? Saya nggak lihat Alvin. Alvin mana ya? Masuk nggak?
Tadi dia mau coba masuk Pak. Katanya harus pakai passcode dan passcode-nya nggak bisa.
Ya, udah saya betulkan. Coba masuk lagi deh. Tolong minta Alvin untuk masuk lagi.
Oke, siap Pak.
Baik, guys. After this, I will give you assignments just for the online journalism class ya. So for the others like Pak Mulkan or Bu Yusniani or those from the master's degree class from S2, you don't have to do the assignment. The assignment is only for the S1 people. accept if you want to join us into doing that assignment. So you're welcome. You're very welcome. Bude, do you want to say something? There's some question. Lah, komit lagi.
Oh, okay. Hi, Mindy. Thank you for your presentation. I'm still in the middle of the meeting that I'm up there, but I still listen to you. And for me, we have lots of research about journalism, especially in environmental journalism. As you know, that my concern is on that issue. And usually I, Dandi, and Rinda work together in environmental journalism. Like this moment, I mean, this week, we talk about fake news about crocodile issues, and it spreads all over the country. I mean, it's not only in Indonesia, because the source, the pictures that were spread for the fake news come from Mexico, and also some of them were used repeatedly in different issues, like crocodile eat a woman in some pit with the same pictures. Crocodile eat a girl in Madura with the same picture. So it is easy for them to make fake news with from other source. And for me, it is, what is it? Is it kind of ridiculous that they spread a kind of hoax like that? But in the environmental issue, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
In the chat, Carolina.
Yes.
Maybe you could type in the chat.
Yeah. I have to move. I think I have to move. Okay. Okay. One more thing that I want to ask you is, how could we? I would make a research about the cognitive or the knowledge of the journalists about environment. What do you think that we need? The method is, I don't really like the survey, because the survey is just quantitative. I need more about their meaning, about their concerns, about the environmental, about the climate change, about the conservation. But what do you think? As you know, that ethnography is not really, it's not really
that
quite
sounds
fit.
more like you would want to do the qualitative interviews, because you would want to, formulate some, some questions that you would ask a number of journalists, right? Like, so maybe 20 or 30 journalists, and you would interview them one-on-one and ask them about what you just said, their attitude about the environmental journalism and so on.
Oh, sorry.
Whenever it's something like you want attitudes about a topic that's, I don't know, not so a narrow topic, right? You want their attitudes about that subject. That right away to me suggests qualitative interviews, right? Because you want to talk to them for about 30 minutes, not just 2 minutes, right? You want to talk to them for maybe 30 minutes. You want to ask the same questions to every journalist and get their answers, and then explore a little further after your arranged questions, maybe talk more and record it. What you normally do is you record the interview, the audio, and then you transcribe the interview, which is really annoying, but it's necessary, because then you go through every statement in the transcription and you find similarities and differences between the people you interviewed.
Okay, thank you, Mindy. But you know that I always argue with Dandi, because I always try to criticize them, while Dandi try to make a construction of their thinking. So for me, it's take a long time to make a construction. I put Yes.
A lot of research, people don't realize how long it takes.
Yeah.
Right? Like this article is not that long, but it sometimes takes a whole year to do the research before you even write the article.
Yeah. Well, I always like to make it shorter than it should. So I try to criticize them. That's what we argue a lot with. I always argue that with Dandy through the methodology about the research.
And I always make it. I will always expand the word characters. To make it longer.
But
Okay,
one of the students, Ribka, wrote in here, there's a question in here. She has a question about viral journalism. Actually, well, let's see. Viral content, yes, but not a lot of journalism has gone viral. But I think if you know of a case, that's a kind of thing I think you could possibly do a case study about how one news item or one report spread and spread and spread. You'd have to like go back to the origin, to the first story, and sort of trace how did it spread. Like that would be your research, and you're describing that how it happened, how it worked would be, I think in the end that would be a case study, right? It might include a content analysis, because if it was not people just copying the identical content and sharing like a copy and a copy and a copy, but instead they would say it in their own words or something like that, then maybe you would analyze the content of how did it change from the original to all the later versions that spread everywhere. It would depend on what it was like. It would have to be a real thing, right? And then you would you'd probably figure out how much content analysis to use, or whether it was a case study, by looking at, well, what exactly happened, right? Like how many variations were there? How did it spread? How far did it spread? I think that's something you could do. If you had the ability to, sort of follow it, like a lot of little paths that you were following, to see, how did there have been a lot of studies about viral media, but usually viral stuff is often, memes, or, advertising gimmicks, like the Harlem Shake or something from TikTok. Those people who, like, one person does a dance and then everybody on TikTok does the dance. So I can't think of an example of viral journalism, but maybe there is something. Maybe you have something in mind. I hope there she is. Hi, Ribka. I just saw, there you are. Is that a good answer? Is that enough, or do you have a further question?
Yeah, it's about when journalists gathering news from social media like TikTok or Instagram. Sometimes it happens to journalists when they repost it again and make it as a news. So I'm thinking probably related to the news value also. Yeah.
It might not really fit a standard of viral, right? It might just be more like there's a thing called the bandwagon effect. Like one news organization writes a story about something, like, I don't know, I can't think of an example offhand, but like one organization writes about it, and then all of a sudden everybody's writing the same thing, right? But not necessarily copying, but it's like they all just took the same idea and wrote their own version of it. But I don't think that's exactly the same as viral. Right? Yeah, like I said, there have been studies about viral media, and usually they sort of talk about, often a lot of viral things spread, they're visual, right? They're often, you know, video or images, you know, people doing something and then making a video of it. Like I said, memes often go viral, right? Everybody's sharing the same meme. Yeah.
I think I need to read a lot of viral media that you say.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mindy.
You're welcome.
Right. Anyone want to raise their hands? We still have 10 minutes, right, Mindy?
10 minutes.
Because I don't want you to wait too late tonight.
At least this time it's not my bedtime.
Good.
My bedtime is 30 minutes from now. 40 minutes. 40 minutes.
Yeah, right. Okay, guys, do you have still something to discuss? For you from the online journalism class S1, please, after our discussion now, please don't leave the room yet, because we have to discuss the assignments. Yeah. Okay. Right. I think our S1 students still try to figure out the research thing. Because now they are still doing our assignment, our fieldwork assignment. So we asked them to create stories as a group, as a group of well, you can call it a small newsroom. So we can publish their stories in our websites, and they're trying to be online journalists. So that's why we asked them to do not only a textual article, but also have to capture photos and videos as well. So we can also make some kind of content that we can publish from on YouTube. So they're trying to be a what we call it in the old days, a backpack journalists, or
oh yeah,
one man show journalists. So that's what they are doing now. You know, they have to do anything in the field by themselves. So I believe that last week you also explained about curation. Is it? It's right. Yeah. So they also trying to do that as well, to do some curation, and they also need to be convergent journalists. So they try to create one topic, but it has to be available to be produced and published in every kind of formats, every kind of platforms. So that's their assignment. So it's quite hard, you know. it's quite hard work. All right, guys. If you don't have anything to share or anything to discuss, maybe we can let Mindy to have a rest before her bedtime. And so, all right. Last chance. Anyone want to ask?
Last chance.
Discuss something. Last chance. All right. If there's no one to raised hand. So I think we can call it a night, call it a day for you, Mindy.
Night for me.
Night for you, a day for us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, and we really appreciate your presence in our 2 classes starting from last week. And we're still hoping that you have permission to have travel back to us, the real travel.
Yeah,
the
someday.
physical traveling.
It's been so long since I was on a plane. I don't even remember what it's like.
It's about 25 hours. That's not long.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, I remember that part.
Yeah, 25 hours long flight from Florida to here to Bandung.
For me, I usually have to take 3 planes, so it's even longer.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah.
And just information for you, Mindy, your apartment is still there. So if you want to go back to your apartment, so that's still available. All right. So thank you very much.
Right.
And we have a kind of certificate that we want to give you, but I think we will send you by email.
Okay,
so
that sounds
just
good.
for our appreciation for your contribution to our class. So thank you very much, Mindy.
That's great.
And this materials is really useful. We record this meeting so we can use it for our material to other class, especially for the research methodology class. Thank you very much.
Good. Okay.
Right. So,
good.
Do you have something to share for last time, Mindy?
What? Like last words?
Yeah, last words or something, or
just
advice,
I would say I hope that maybe students now have a little idea about how many different things research can cover. It's just, it's infinite, right? So when you say research in digital journalism, each research article is very specific, very focused on one little thing, right? So there are just so many topics and so many ways to do research. So hopefully maybe that was something new that you learned today.
Thank you very much. This is new for them, for the SA2 students, but maybe this is also the enlightenment, the enrichment for those who are doing research today, just like Pak Shahid and his friends. Right. Thank you very much, Mindy.
Okay.
So I think you can have rest now, and just let me do the assignment, the marking, and everything, so you don't have to do that. Thank you. Right. You can still hear if you want to join my conversation with the students. But
no, I'm going to sign off.
All right, and that's all. Thank you. Good evening.
Okay.
Have a good rest, and
thank you.
We'll keep in touch. All right.
All right. Okay. Bye. Everybody's
Bye-bye.
saying thank you. You're very welcome. Bye bye.
Right.
Thank you, Mindy.
Yeah. Bye, Adi. Nice to see you.
Same here.